Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our fifth session of Engaging Associate Faculty. My name is Kate Johnson, and I am the Manager of Faculty Engagement. If this is your first session joining us, welcome. If you signed up and were expecting to see two other speakers today, I do apologize. There were some travel complications, and so we will try to have Dr. Marvi Mar and Dr. Steph Young-Gonzaga on at another time. So I am very excited to introduce you all to Dr. Dixon Anderson. Dixon is originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and is now in San Diego. He attended the University of Georgia for his BA and Georgia State for his MS. He recently completed his doctorate in psychology from the University of Rockies in 2016, and is a glutton for punishment and currently a candidate for the MBA at Ashford. His main areas of interest are psychological contract and the effects of contract breaches on organizations and employees. And Dixon also works for Zovio. I had the opportunity to see Dixon's presentation at our research symposium. Obviously, since it had adjunct faculty in there, I was interested in what he had to say, but what he ended up sharing to me spoke to exactly the reason why we're having this series. So without further ado, and without stealing any of his thunder, I would like to hand off to Dr. Anderson.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you. It's a pleasure. I'm just going to talk about something really dear to my heart, which is adjunct faculty, because I have such great respect for the work that they do, and also some of the challenges that have occurred. And so when I began working on and thinking about an idea for the dissertation, the concept of I want to use adjunct faculty, but let me find a method, a way of looking at what's going on with them. And so I chose something called psychological contract breach and a process called phenomenology. I won't get too deep in the woods, and if I do, Kate has promised to pull me out, and I'm just going to kind of let the PowerPoint complement some of the talking points that I have. And then at the very end, if you guys are okay with it, I'll answer any questions that you have. And I'd like to kind of start with right away, which is, why did I do the study? What did I find out, and why do we care about this? And the thing that I found out about why I wanted to do the study was that it's probably no secret to any one of you there. If you Google or check out any magazines or go online, go to the library, what have you, and you type in adjunct faculty, you're going to get all kinds of things popping up, and many of them are not positive. They talk about the challenges that adjunct faculty are facing across a whole host of issues. And interestingly, yesterday on LinkedIn, there was a great article about psychological contract breach and the effect that's occurring with the gig economy and employers who, they call the gig employers like Uber, Lyft, and others. So this phenomenon is kind of seeping out and moving into other areas as well. And it's been around for about 50 years. But with adjunct faculty, I wanted to find out, we know that they're basically temporary, or you may hear called associate faculty or as needed or non-permanent. But I wanted to find out, how did these guys feel? What were the experiences that they encountered when they had the case of psychological contract breach and how it affected them in their jobs? And why we care about this is you probably already know is that back in the late 60s, there was probably 35% adjunct faculty in higher education. Today it's 70%. It's going to continue to grow. So when you have that kind of population, then you certainly want to know what's going on. So I'm going to share with you some of the things I found out. And like I said, it isn't a pretty picture, but at the same time, there are things that can be done from an individual standpoint and also from an institutional standpoint. So let me just kind of move forward a little bit and we'll go forward. There is a lot that educational institutions can do. And then one of the things you're going to see is some of the things that the adjunct faculty said, hey, people can do this today to help us out. It costs nothing. And I just want to kind of cover the role that we all can do in many ways to help out, not solve everything, but definitely do our part to kind of engage more and do more. So let's just kind of move forward just a little bit. And I want to talk about what psychological contract breach is. And again, I won't go too deep into this. There's a lot of literature on it, obviously. But basically, a psychological contract breach is when an individual believes that an obligation has been made between him or herself and the employer. And it is an unwritten contract, so it's psychological in that there's a concept of reciprocity, meaning that tit for tat, I'm going to do something and you're going to do something for me. And you often see it in a case of where the employer will say to the employee, hey, if you work hard, do your job, hunker down, do everything you need to do, and you exceed your goals, then you can definitely be in line for a promotion. He didn't promise a promotion, but he just talked about it could be there. So the individual does it and he works really hard, and lo and behold, now comes the time for the promotion. The guy gets passed over or the lady gets passed over. So that's the breach. The breach is when the individual feels that someone has failed to meet the obligation that they had talked about, meaning, hey, I did all of these things, but I didn't get the promotion. And that's where the breach is, because it's the first thought process or cognition of, hey, somebody didn't hold up his end of the bargain here. What's going on? And then the final part of the whole construct is the violation, because this is the part where the individual says, okay, something's not right. A breach has occurred here. This is what I think about it. This is my reaction, like, for example, passivity or anger. And this is my behavior, which is, okay, I'll do nothing, or I'll steal something from the company, or I'll slow down doing things. Because the literature does talk about the long-term deleterious effects that the breach of contract has, everything from absenteeism to negative attitude to, as I mentioned, theft of property, and also of a total kind of feeling of, if you don't honor your obligations, there's no obligation for me to do that either. So it does affect an organization and the people involved. Now, to be a part of the survey and to work with individuals, it was a semi-structured interview process using phenomenology and a process called the Van Kam method. And one of the challenges that I had was, as part of that, was to really keep my own opinions and judgments to myself, to minimize the researcher bias, but also occasionally having to tell everyone that I interviewed, which is, please don't interpret my silence as not interest. I'm very interested, but I don't want in any way to kind of guide you or reflect on, what I think about what you're saying. So that way you're able to bracket things in a way where you're letting the experience of these individuals speak for itself without influencing them. After it was all said and done, after all of the data was compiled, the adjunct faculty said, okay, we have little communication. That's one of the biggest things that they spoke about. They talked about little support. They felt it was just a job and really nothing more. They felt excluded. They felt that their field determined how they got treated by people. Let's say, liberal arts versus one of the STEM type areas. Hard to get to know your colleagues. Higher education has turned into a total business, the educational industrial complex, as was mentioned. Not included in a lot of the decisions. The system seems a little rigged. There is some retaliation going on. If you're not full-time faculty, you're not real faculty, you're just a part-time disposable. And for-profit appear to encourage passing the student more than public or not-for-profit. And low pay, which you'll hear and read everywhere across the board. So all of these factors were what they were feeling from the process. Now, so through their experience, these are some of the things that were going. And then as you interview and as you drill down and you start putting themes to what's being said, and you're understanding what their experiences are, their reactions, and the meanings that they ascribe to these experiences, because Some people feel totally different. When breach occurs, for some people, they just shrugged their head and said, what can you do? Other people, they reacted and they wanted to do something. They wanted to advocate. They wanted action to occur. So in compiling the data, the essences of there were three major ones that came out, was that this group of people felt that they had somehow lost an identity as an educator due to the nature of the adjunct faculty relationship with the institution. In other words, what they thought were going to occur and what they would experience turned out to be a lot different. So there was this loss of, hey, this didn't quite work out how I saw myself. Now, number two, now this is interesting, and I know it's a little provocative, and I'll talk to it a little bit more, but there was one of the other essences were a cycle of grief, attempting to come to terms with this loss of the identity as an educator and their subsequent shift to the identity of a facilitator, which was info in, info out, I'm the middleman, that's what I do. That's pretty much, how they saw it. And then third was an overall feeling at the end of the day, a resignation to the status quo by just feeling powerless. So when they would experience breach and they would go through this process, these were the themes that continued to, rise up in what was going on with these guys. Now, let's kind of go and dig a little bit deeper here, just a little bit. So after they've experienced the breach, we now kind of understand the essences of what's going on. If we look at the experience, the breach that occurred right up front was the breach was experienced as indicated by a gap between what they expected through the interview employment process and reality. Now, in the symposium, someone said, hey, they knew what they were getting into, so why are they whining about it? And I get where that comes from, but it's almost like a blame the victim kind of mentality. And I'm not trying to be too judgmental there, but we don't really know if they were told something totally different. We just assume that they're whining and, man up kind of thing. But in fact, what they are talking about is, hey, what was told and what I experienced was totally different than what I got. So this was the first level of psychological contract breach that these guys were experiencing. And that leads to the reaction, which is, okay, not what I expected. And I throw out Elizabeth Kubler-Ross here because most everybody ties that into a grieving process, and that is true. But in her later work, when she talked about denial, when she talked about anger, when she talked about, acceptance, she changed that to also talk about the loss of a job, the change of a job, basically anything that affected the individual in a way other than just the grieving process. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did a great deal of work after that 1969 book about what this really means and what people go through when they face these things. And then the meaning of what they ascribed to this experience was all individualized to them, with those things being, hey, we're not being treated right here. The ball is being dropped somewhere, and I don't understand why. Why are they these two major levels here, and there's so much missing? Because remember, in the late 60s, only 35% of higher education faculty was adjunct. Today, over 70-something% are, and it's going to continue. Now, it's a very fair question to say, and I did ask after it was all said and done, if you're not satisfied and these are the kind of the themes going through, why do you keep teaching? How do you reconcile it? So what happened was there was a continued theme of something that I'll refer to and see if this helps pull it together a little bit, of an ideal self or an external status versus an internal status. And what I mean by that is, you're in school, you're getting a PhD or you're getting a doctorate degree, you're going to teach, you see yourself in that role, you kind of have an image, an ideal image of what that's about, whether that's, really working closely with faculty or doing research, or whether it's teaching and all of that you have, pictured in your mind. And so the external status, though, is different than the internal. The internal is You guys who are watching this, doctors, many of you with faculty, everybody can kind of play in the same sandbox because you're equal in educational credentials, et cetera. So it's not that big of a deal. The status is kind of the same. But if you say, hey, Uncle Dixon got his doctorate and he's teaching at the university, to the external people who don't live in the university setting or the education setting, that's going to be a big deal to them. And that's going to, in their mind, also bring up a great deal of imagery about what it means that they've seen on TV or whatever they've been imprinted with as to what that means. So the participants that in this particular study saw a difference between what the ideal of that was and what it really became. So some of the responses was, as I mentioned, the internal status, the external status, but they talked about, I keep teaching and I reconcile it because, one, I love learning. I matter. I really do want to make a difference here. And on a personal note, I think many of us know that to be the case because I can remember my first grade teacher. I can remember the powerful impact that a high school teacher made on me. And then when I got to college, some of the professors that I met who were incredible. So these things will always exist. And on a personal note too, when I was doing my dissertation at the Rockies, the committee I had was absolutely phenomenal. And I will never forget each of them because they each played a certain role. So educators do matter. They make a true difference. And also these guys continue to talk about, hey, I achieved a major accomplishment here. I like helping this education process. I want to do research. I like getting the recognition. And sometimes even if I can't put a phrase or a word to it, I know it when I see it and I like it and I feel like this is where I want to be. So even though they're facing this cognitive dissonance between what I expected and what I've gotten, these guys are still in it. They want to do it. They want it to get better because they do have these reasons for loving it and wanting to continue it. So keeping with this theme again of, well, what else? Talk to me a little bit more. Why do you teach? So let me follow it up with this. They want to continue teaching. They want to be treated a little differently, as we know. And even when they face breach, they talk about the love of students, the teaching and the learning. They talked about the achievement, as I mentioned, of a lifetime goal, because it does take a long time. The satisfaction that comes from this achievement, because it is a big deal. The ideal of being a professor and obtaining this degree, the status was a big factor. And also a lot of people had personal reasons. So this all goes into a funnel and comes out as to, hey, I still like what I do. I still love to teach, and here are the reasons why. But also when I experience what I've experienced, I'm not a happy camper. So let's look at some takeaways. So we know this bigger picture of what's going down. The faculty says, here's some things you can do and it doesn't cost anything. And this is particularly for full-time faculty who really engage a lot of their adjuncts, for people who really get it, the picture, who know what I'm talking about here already, and who have reached out, who try to engage, who are doing everything they can to say, you do matter, you do count, let me engage you, because the end product is your teaching of people, and we want that process to be an incredible one for both the educator, the institution, and of course the students. So many of you listening to this right now have given of yourself, I know, a lot to help adjunct faculty. And so adjunct is simply saying, hey, keep your promises or explain why you can't follow through. The easiest way to prevent breach is not to promise anything. I think sometimes people make promises, they may not even know they've made one, but it was interpreted by that individual as, yeah, you just made a promise, you just obligated yourself, and I hope you come through. But in any case, if you make a promise and you can't follow through with it, let them know. Explain why that is. And I'll tell you in a moment why that's very important. Secondly is, if you can't deliver it, don't promise it. Now, these are very simple things, but a lot of people have their own reasons for doing this. But if you can't deliver it, it's best just to avoid it. Also, again, many of you know these are just kind of probably reminders, but communicate at the appropriate levels with less reliance on email. We already know from about 50 to 60% of email messages are misinterpreted. That is a big statistic. And if you can speak to a group, if you can gather your people, if you will, and speak to them to tell them about promises not kept or why something is being done, you actually begin to cut through a lot of the problems that you can experience. And I know that's a very simple thing, but it's often forgotten. People tend, if they're going to give bad news or if they can't follow through or they don't want to be held accountable, the best way to kind of communicate then is people start doing email. And yes, it gets the message out, but in the worst way possible. So they also say take responsibility. You often see breach here where, let's say I saw this about a month ago, a factory's closing, and what they did was they sent out someone that the employees did not know, had never met, did not know what the employee did at all, to tell them they were losing their jobs. Their supervisors were nowhere around, their managers, the leadership, nobody. It was like they just brought someone from, facilities in to say, hey, pack your boxes. So you talk about breach, there's a perfect example of it. And the reactions of that, you can imagine what occurred. It was kind of like Storm the Bastille. I was watching it and I was like, okay, here's a lesson learned. So you've got to be responsible and you've got to respond as quick as you can when you know. And even if you have to delay the response, if you say, we're only delaying it because we don't have all the facts, we're going to keep you in the loop, but it's worse that I tell you something that's not true, so just bear with me. They actually appreciate that. And then many of you I know do this. You do express appreciation and you acknowledge adjunct faculty contributions. And whether you do that personally or through some kind of recognition offering, many of you do that. And that's very much appreciated. We all like that, which is that goes back to that point that they had of I matter. Do I matter? If I do, it would be nice to know that. Now, here's some other things. The adjunct faculty as a whole, and I know, as we all do, adjunct faculty, and I've talked to several of my friends who teach, and one day I'm talking and one of my close friends just said, Dixon, I feel completely isolated. I'm teaching all these accounting classes, but I'm not engaged, and I just see my schedule. I teach. I don't really know anyone. I don't go to the events. It just is what it is. So it was this concept of, hey, if we are one team, then I'm not an expert at this, but somebody's got to bring us together so that we reflect that. Also, reinforce the relevancy through peer coaching and working together. Minimize the exclusion and the isolation, kind of going back to the one team. Include in decision-making, as we know, when possible. Do not retaliate. Nothing worse than saying, hey, speak your mind. You can say anything you want. And the person does, and then they're terminated, I mean, it happens. It really does. That's another perfect example of a breach. Also, again, include the recognition, the activities and awards, and also pay and benefits. They're not good. Everybody, I think, kind of knows that. That's not a secret. Those things come up in every interview, most all articles you read. And just to give you a flavor of just this past month, I pulled up an article and it said adjunct faculty, America's fast food workers. The other one, this was in Atlantic magazine. It was the death of adjunct faculty. So these are the things that you can see. These are the big headlines that are catching a lot of attention. So they're not really subtle. So in summary, this is why I did the study and why I think it's important. Adjunct faculty are here to stay. They're only going to increase in number, so they have to be engaged. Now, I don't have all the answers, but they're telling us some of the things that all of us can do right away to make them feel more engaged. But whoever can master the concept of engagement and make that happen, that's going to be an incredible contribution to the university or to anyone. And that can make a great paper as well. 2, know the people, know their strengths, use their contributions, let their skills shine. Because many of them, these are talented people. You don't get a PhD or a doctorate, because you're slack. Ask how do institutions value, support, and increase the adjunct satisfaction. Some institutions have absolutely no method, no commitment to it. I believe Ashford does. I believe the Rockies did, but not every institution does. Then ask, this is a big key, ask what, a lot of people don't know what psychological contract breach is, or what even psychological contract is. So I talk to people and I help them understand what it is and how it affects their bottom line. And it's something really good to know, not just because it sounds fancy, but because it has a lot of good effects or bad effects depending on how it's implemented. And then one of the things is this will help people understand that perception is key and that what you say does matter. And for those folks who think that they could just get out there and say what they want and there's going to not be any repercussions, that's not true. All of this information does matter, and how you come across and what you say, that's key. You've got to be very careful. And again, one of the keys is try to stay away from promises if you can. And two, don't overpromise. And if you do promise anything, deliver it, because in the background, people are always looking at the tit for tat. What have you done for me lately? And if you haven't done anything for them lately, they'll get back. There will be some kind of reaction. So I just want to share this with you too. I know you guys have this recorded. You'll be able to refer to it. I just went through the key references here that I know really made a difference when I looked through everything and what I liked. Conway is a huge, huge person in the field. Denise Russo, that was referenced in the LinkedIn article about the gig economy and psychological contract breach. Fascinating read about how people are bailing out on the gig economy, Uber, Lyft, et cetera, because these companies have broken the breach with these guys so many times, and they're like, hey, I don't need that anymore. And then finally, obviously they're going to take questions, but this is my name, my number, my email. If you want to look at the study, just go to the link in ProQuest, and it'll be there for you. So I hope that helps, and I'm going to open up the floor, and Kate, take it away and tell me what to do.
Yes, awesome. We've got a couple of questions here already. The first one was just what, and if you can share, what institutions you surveyed. Was it Ashford? Was it a combination of institutions?
Yes, it was a combination of all four-year universities. It was a combination of public, private, online. So it was a combo. It was a mix of all of that.
Okay. A question was looking for additional examples of overpromising.
If you do really well in the classes, it looks like we can schedule you for more. So basically tied to revenue. Because one of the things I learned is that I don't bring it up here, but it is in the dissertation itself. Some of the research studies showed that if you're in what they call the mature stage of your career, then actually the way you felt about being an adjunct faculty was totally different than folks coming right out of their PhD program, people in the 20s, 30s, and even 40s. It was totally different because these guys kind of been there, done that, and we're not looking at it basically as being a financial anchor. The money just wasn't as important. However, there's a whole population of adjunct faculty for which this is a very big part of their budget, and this is key to them about the pay and the benefits. So that is one of the things that really hit home with me, where when I was saying, okay, let's find out what the themes are, which is do well, teach in the class. Your classes are good. You'll get more classes to teach. Also in the interview process. And many of these people, by the way, teach at multiple schools. And one of the things we found out in the breach process was that's why they switched to different schools as well. If you give me breach at this school, I'm going to jump over here to the other one. I'm going to try to find the one that basically violates me the least.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure, this is kind of my own personal question is, sometimes those psychological contract breaches can happen. And potentially your research didn't go quite this far, but is there a mending process, right? can the institution come back from it if we're starting to do intentional work around engagement, around recognition, things like that? Are those breaches amendable?
Yes. And let me add one thing to it. I mentioned earlier, this is something fascinating, is that if the individuals who feel they have experienced breach, if they like you, and even if you're the one who did the breach, you broke the promise, if they like you, if they respect you, if they feel that you have truly been fair to them and treated them, fairly across the board, then they are less likely to react in a negative manner, even when that breach is negative. So if you have had some kind of relationship with your employees, or if you've had some kind of positive, fair relation with your adjunct faculty, then even if you have to give bad news or a breach occurs, that group statistically is going to more accept that and react less negatively than if it's coming from someone who they don't know and who they did not like and who they did not respect. Which always brings me, it was like my earlier example of the factory that was closing, going to Mexico, and they push all of the leadership away and send out basically the facilities guy to say that. Now, anybody should have gotten with them and said, hey, even if you don't know about breach or psychological contract, that is a terrible thing to do.
Right.
Anybody just common sense would say that's not going to work. Who do these guys like the most? Let them give the news. But to your question, yes, it can be amended, it can be ameliorated, it can be lessened and softened, and it can be turned around.